And thank you very much for the invitation to this conference, which is really very exciting for me. Especially to Yemima, I want to thank because I was quite in doubt if a conference to this topic and taking as an occasion I and thou would be the right thing to deal about women and relationship. But you convinced me in one afternoon, so I joined, and I'm not sad that I joined. I find it very interesting. I will speak today about Martin Buber and Auguste Hauschner. So she's an author nearly nobody knows. But I hope this will change in the future. Taking Martin Buber's I and Thou as an occasion to ask specifically about women who engage with Buber's philosophy of religion implies that Buber's dialogical principle would provoke responses from women that could be identified as specifically feminine and open up specifically feminine resonant spaces of his philosophy of religion thought. I understand the general title of this conference, Women Write Buber, in such a way that thinking about these answers and resonant spaces does not have to be limited to I and thou, but it may rather go beyond it, as you all did yesterday anyway. However, I do not want to lose sight of the occasion, the jubilee of I and thou, in which Martin Buber unfolds his dialogical principle. In the following, I'd like to stir my reflections in two directions, each of which I would like to explain by way of example. First, I pursue a feminine response to Buber's I and Thou. Using Gertrud Kolmar's poetical poem Die Dichterin, the poetess, written in 1932, I would like to show what such a feminine response to Buber's dialogical principle might look like. Secondly, in demarcation, I want to open a feminist resonance space with the novels Die Familie Lobositz, The Lobositz Family, and Rudolf and Camilla, written 1908 and 1910. As both novels were written long before Buber's I and Thou, in the elaborated version of my lecture, I will take at first a step to argue that they share similar spaces of thinking. So the first chapter will be to talk about romanticism and romantic poetry and a bit of Herder as well. I think he's quite important for I and Thou, but I will skip this for this lecture here. But I want you to know that I think they shared similar thinking spaces, similar literary traditions, so that you will follow my argumentation that Hauschner is somewhat like a feminist counterpart to Martin Buber. Auguste Hauschner, a well-known journalist and author at her time, was born in Prague in 1815. She maintained a literary salon in Berlin, which was frequented by many important men, among them her cousin Fritz Mautner, Gustav Landauer, and many others. Mainly in this function as a salonière, she was perceived by her male companions. In order to bring her, whose philosophical thinking was not taken seriously, into conversation with the famous Martin Buber, I take up the pejorative designation of ladies' philosopher, which Buber was given. It's directed, I think, primarily from a position of strict science against his writing as a philosophizing poet. In contrast to many of the gentleman philosophers, the female philosopher Margarete Sussmann, we just heard about her, does understand what Buber is undertaking with his way of writing. And not only her, but also some males as well, as Gustav Landauer, for example. In her essay on Buber's Hasidic tales, which she holds in high esteem, she writes, and I did it in German and English as well. Eine strenge Begriffssprache von diesem Buch zu verlangen, hieße, seinen Sinn und Geist misszuverstehen. Und doch ist es auch keineswegs die Sprache des Kunstwerks, der Dichtung, die redet. Es ist Gleichnisrede und Interjektion, aber nicht die Gleichnisrede des Dichters, und darauf kommt es mir an, dem das Gleichnis nur die unmittelbare Verwandlung aus der Blüte des Erlebnisses zur Frucht ist, sondern die Gleichnisrede dessen, der mit dem Stoff ringt und dem das Gleichnis nicht letzte Reife, sondern die einzige Vermittlung zwischen dem lautlosen Inneren und der lauten Sprache, der mühsam und schwer gestammelte Ausdruck unsagbaren Erlebens ist. Sussman makes an essential distinction. She conceives Martin Buber, despite all the poetic polish by Paula Winkler, as a philosopher, not as a poet. The author construction Martin Buber had chosen for his working process on the Hasidic tales, for which he, as a male religious philosopher, asked the female poet for support, suggests that Martin Buber would not have objected to this assessment. But the scientific reception of the Hasidic tales reacts to the male author's name, Martin Buber, and is disturbed by his female transgression of gender-specific barriers of writing. I want to take a closer look on these barriers, on the two examples I chose, the feminine and the feminist ones. First to the feminist one, to Gertrud Kolmar. Gertrud Kolmar was born in Berlin in 1894. She was murdered in Auschwitz in 1942. Kolmar was an almost devout reader of Martin Buber, as can be seen from letters to his sister Hilde, who fled to England. She regularly immersed herself in the Hasidic tales on Shabbat. Her poem, Die Dichterin, opens the cycle of poems Die Frau und die Tiere, The Woman and the Animals, which was completed in 1933 and published by Erwin Loewe's Jüdische Buchverlag in 1938. As an opening poem, the text is very prominently placed. It may be understood as a programmatic prelude to the following poems of that volume's gathers. In the poem, the book we have just opened, addresses us directly with its own voice. Even more, the poet herself is the book. It is her we hold in our hands, more precisely in our clenched fists. In all her liveliness, she has surrendered herself to us readers with and in her poetry, in a book made of cardboard, a thing, ein Ding, mit Dinggeschick, with the fate of things. The liveliness of this thing is revealed exclusively to those who enter into a loving relationship with the poetry, right? With her poetry. The speaking instance, the poet addressing us directly, has done her utmost to ignite our love. Pure and shy like a bride, she courts us, hoping to open our fist and thus to abolish the violent relationship to the thing that the living poet has become, the printed poem. The poetess is entitled to this hope in a special, nature-given way. For, quotation, who should hope if not a woman? Her whole activity is a single you. The next but one stanza relates the special female ability for dialogue with an inverting turn of Martin Buber's dialogue principle. And that is read. Ich and du becomes du and ich. The lover, marked as a female, or I can read it, the man is so much wiser than we are. Der Mann ist so viel klüger als wir sind. In seinem Reden unterhält er sich mit Tod und Frühling, Eisenwerk und Zeit. Ich sage du und immer wieder du und immer du und ich. Und dann geht's weiter und dieses Buch ist eines Mädchens Kleid, also sozusagen die Braut, die sich dem Geliebten anbietet oder um ihn wirbt. The lover, marked as a female, submits to an unquestionable superior male spirituality and performance. But in the poem, this inferior relationship seems to be reserved. It is a revolt that owes much to the concept of the woman as a great lover, a concept which enjoyed quite some popularity in poems and novels of the literary avant-garde around 1900. In his prose novel, Malte Lauritzbrügge, perhaps the most important narrative text of avant-garde modernism, and we heard Etty Hillesum read Rilke, and I think that's interesting. So in this novel of Rainer Maria Rilke, he gives these great lovers a vivid contour in their relationship to the man they love, and I think it's important to Martin Buber's I and Thou, one of the important texts. Das Schicksal liebt es, Muster und Figuren zu erfinden. Seine Schwierigkeit beruht im Komplizierten, so heißt es eben in diesem Prosaroman oder in diesen Prosastücken, kann man vielleicht eher sagen. Das Leben selbst aber ist schwer aus Einfachheit. Es hat nur ein paar Dinge von uns nicht abgemessener Größe. Der Heilige, indem er das Schicksal ablehnt, wählt diese Dinge, Gott gegenüber. Dass aber die Frau ihrer Natur nach in Bezug auf den Mann die gleiche Wahl treffen muss, ruft das Verhängnis aller Liebesbeziehungen herauf. Entschlossen und schicksallos wie eine Ewige steht sie neben ihm, der sich verwandelt. Immer übertrifft die Liebende den Geliebten. Also hier scheint es so, als würde sich dieses Unterlegenheitsverhältnis umkehren. That the woman by her nature makes the same choice in relation to man as the latter does towards God shows that the figure of inversion, as Kolmar also uses it in her poem, can hardly be read as an emancipatory revolt in view of gender relations. While the masculine eye can only think dialogue out of his historical conditionality and eye referentiality, and therein misses a true dialogue, the naturally eternal feminine eye succeeds in her dialogue with the beloved thou, and if I understand Levinas right, he's thinking and elaborating this thought further. For Kolmar's poem, however, it will be possible to spell out the ironic undertone that is clearly audible here, and which allows to read her feminine response to Buber as a feminist one. I go back to this first stanza, which is marked red, where I read irony. This line could be traced beyond Kolmar to the feminist literature of the 1970s, and one would be going to Ingeborg Bachmann and her story Undine geht. And Bachmann herself was a reader of Buber, and we will hear later on Bachmann and Bachmann's Malina. I'm really excited what we will hear then. But I think there is a line, and there's a line not only because Bachmann read Buber, but because she is in a direct dialogue with Paul Celan and his Meridian speech 1 year before, and Paul Celan also is an intense reader of Martin Buber. In order to open up shared lines of tradition and spaces of thought for my second example, Auguste Hauschner, I don't want to look forward, but instead back. Here I want to emphasize three aspects. First, the great lovers are not an invention of the avant-garde. They lead us back, at least, to Christian bridal mysticism, which Martin Buber, and not only him, was very fond of in the years Hauschner wrote her two novels. In his collection Ecstatic Confessions, published in 1909, he gave them a large space, and he himself says so in his foreword. Second, this line can be drawn further to the female lovers of the romantic art enthusiasts. In programmatic texts of art religion, such as, for example, Novalis, Heinrich von Ofterdingen, these female lovers have a hinge function, also eine Scharnierfunktion, that connects religion of art and religion of love, Liebe als Passion, also passionate love. Martin Buber ties into this tradition. although in I and Thou much more sober than in these early years when he's interested in this bright mystic. Auguste Hauschner is very pronounced not fond of passive love, for a feminist insight that Liebesleidenschaft brings more suffering than joy, mainly to women, but also to men. Third, in I and Thou, the erotically charged texts of women mysticism make place for mystical writings in which other images are found. In the text of Meister Eckhart, I think I said something in this direction yesterday, in the text of Meister Eckhart and other primarily male speech incidents come to word now. For the dialogue principle, their metaphors of imagination, also Einbildung, and reflection, Spiegelung, seem to be much more appropriate than the metaphors of erotic union with a heavenly groom. Buber did not lose, I think, his early interest in these border crossings between language and silence, which made him so interesting for the poets of the avant-garde and vice versa. But the accent of his interest has shifted to, I think, ethical questions. We talked about it yesterday, if there's some development in his work, and I think this would be one. Away from models of passive expectation to models of active, reciprocal love relationships. And from these to ethics. Now I come to Auguste Hauschner. In 1903-1906, the writings of Meister Eckhart are newly edited. An interest in mystical writings in general is general in these years. You find metaphors of mystical imagination, Einbildung and Spiegelung, and in many literary texts around 1900, also metaphors derived from the vocabulary of other religions, especially Far Eastern religions. Metaphysical love, it's a term from Martin Buber, metaphysical love combines with free and social taboo-breaking love, metaphysische Liebe, goes with the latest insights of psychoanalysts, namely those of C.G. Jung. All these new and old metaphors and impulses are not only taken up by the language experiments of the avant-gardes, but also in conventionally narrated texts. You find female femme fatales and femme fragiles, mermaids, we heard about them yesterday, embodying the dangers of female floods. And one of the most famous motives is the motive of incestuous sibling love, in which a variety of these ideas and motives can be bundled. In sultry setting, brother and sister find each other sexually. So in novels by Gerhard Hauptmann, Thomas Manns, Welsungen and in the end, this motive gets a rehabilitation, to say so, in Robert Musil's Mann ohne Eigenschaften, who borrows a lot from Buber's ecstatic confessions. The love of all these sibling couples is sublime, a very modern yin and yang, with a nice side effect of breaking taboos of a bourgeois society. Nothing of this is to be found in the brother and sister couple Rudolf and Camilla that Auguste Hauschner sketches in her novels. We meet the two siblings as children growing up in a Jewish, German-speaking family of Prague bourgeois, far, far away from any original Eastern Judaism. Hauschner's novel sets the differentiated description of an Eastern Jewish world against the folkloristic reception of the Hasidic tales. In some of her letters, it becomes clear how much is she offended by this distorted perception of Eastern Europe. The Lobositz family is Jewish not out of a religious or traditional attachment to Judaism, but out of the insight that it would be irrational to rebel against the biological fact of being part of the Jewish race. In comparison to her brother, Camilla leads a shadowy existence in the Lobositz family. While he is quite well educated, she receives only the most necessary education. She reads bad novels, daydreams a lot, and is very bored. The difference between these two coming-of-age narratives sharply illuminates the inequalities in the lives of a young man and a young woman from a so-called better-off Jewish family. They're two paths and natures that does not come together in a holistic circle, nor does a dynamic, fruitful dialogue grow out of their differences. This narrative technique of a gender-specific, contrasting interweaving of the two narrative strands is continued in the follow-up novel Rudolf and Camilla. Now they are joined by two other couples. One is a Danish couple, male and female cousin, which hold libertine views, not constrained by social barriers, but only by nature. The second one is a Russian, unmarried couple of anarchists, also male and female. They have dedicated themselves to a highly idealistic, dangerous mission that is to support their persecuted comrades in Russia. The two couples, the libertine one and the idealistic one, frame and reflect the young sibling couple who came from the provincial Prague to the metropolis of Berlin in order to find their way of life. Camilla's story now gets much more space. At last there is something happening which is worth to be narrated. In Prague, Camilla suffers a mental breakdown, which is interpreted as a consequence of her too early marriage and motherhood, and she is sent to Berlin for mental recovery. There she attends musical lessons, hoping that practicing music will cure her. Rudolf, her brother, already lives in Berlin. He decided to take a year's vacation from his Prague life, just at Robert Musil's Mann ohne Eigenschaften. But unlike Musil's protagonist, Rudolf is working. As a freelance journalist, he gets into contact with different political, religious, philosophical, and life reform currents in Berlin at the end of the 19th century. Bismarck is his political role model, Stirner and Nietzsche are his political heroes, and his closest friend is an ardent Protestant who left the church to commit himself to social reforms. Even in Berlin, Rudolf and Camilla are hardly in contact with each other. It escapes Rudolf that his sister has fallen into a love affair with a Danish libertine. When her lover abruptly turns away from Camilla, she seeks for consolation in taking drugs. She breaks down a second time. Her husband is summoned from Prague, and surprisingly, he does not insist on pitying Kairis. He is convinced that his wife would never do anything low, and he only cares for anything that can make her well again. Camilla moves to a psychotherapy clinic in the countryside. She talks with the doctor in charge about what happened to her, and he strongly advises Camilla to spare her husband the story about the gun passion. In short, he does not think much of a complete revelation of the couple, as Martin Buber declares it to be the ideal of true marriage in I and Thou. To quote Buber, he said in I and Thou, marriage will never be renewed by anything other than what true marriage always arises from, and we heard it in Katharina's lecture as well, this idea that two people reveal the you to each other. From this you, which is not I to either of them, builds up marriage. This is the metaphysical and metapsychic fact of love, which is only accompanied by feelings of love. By feelings of love. There you have it. At the end of the novel, Camilla returns to husband and child. But she is setting her conditions. If she is to stay with her husband, however good and helpful he may have turned out to be in the past, he will have to emancipate himself. He will have to leave his parental home so that the young family will no longer be dominated of his parents. And he will also have to leave the Jewish ghetto of Prague. Their little daughter shall grow up beyond the confines of the dark ghetto. Rudolf, the brother, also returns to Eastern Europe. Renouncing all his privileges, he wants to train himself to become a great man through hard physical labor and solitary seclusion. He is carried by the conviction that every creature has the duty to develop all its significant things that are in it, and to bring it out into a whole, to the world in a whole. Rudolf's goal, just like that of his sister Camilla, albeit under completely different circumstances, is to found a family, and from families, as you know, society once involved. In deciding for the concept of family, both siblings choose to take social responsibility. I come to the end. Auguste Hauschner and Martin Buber are bound together in mutual esteem. Hauschner reads Buber's writings. Buber perceives her as an important figure and well-connected Salonière. It may be doubted that he read her novels and novellas, although they both deal with the same issue: how ethics can be entered in a world after the death of God. Martin Buber makes a task to reformulate and revive religion, or, spoken with Georg Simmel, religiosity, for the modern age. And also Auguste Hauschner's protagonist is in the very end of the novel in the need of somewhat like religion. Rudolf's creed lies in the works of great art. And he says, I don't have it in the PowerPoint, and away, he says, then that is his creed, and away from all practical interests, lonely and unproven, the path of great art will be found. To the sublimity of foolish works, this is to Nietzsche, to the steps that lead to the temple of true beauty, and to the sanctuary of the unnameable God. The crucial difference between the positions of Martin Buber and Auguste Hauschner lies not in religion, I think. While Buber makes a task to reformulate and revive religion for modernity, Hauschner is concerned with reviving the emancipatory quality of Bildung, which is not the same as education but has much to do with it, and is referring to the ideal of Jewish as well as women emancipation, an ideal that was central for the 19th century. The path of the poetics philosopher leads Martin Buber to the literary avant-garde. The path of the philosophizing poetess leads, at least in the case of Auguste Hauschner, we heard yesterday evening the path of Lasker Schüler was another one. Her paths leads her to a literary realism that puts its narrative technique in the service of emancipation. As Bertolt Auerbach formulates this programmatically in the foreword of a Spinoza novel in 1833, we have nothing more to conceal, nothing more to keep among ourselves, the badness as well as the virtues. Only from clear recognition does reconciliation emerge. The dialogical principle Hauschner develops as a writer is a narrative one, and probably Robert Musil not only borrowed from Buber's ecstatic confessions, but also from Hauschner's Rudolf and Camilla. Hauschner's writing, which aims to be entertaining and comprehensible, makes a claim to social relevance, as well as the dialogical principle of Martin Buber does. But Hauschner demands a consistent emancipation from religion, which is, as she is convinced, only obfuscated by an interest for religion or religiosität, just as the emancipation of women is obfuscated by the romantic invention of passion of love and its avant-garde revival in the great female lovers. Many of the ideas that Berta Pappenheim and other activists of women movement around 1900 fight for are also found in the novels of Auguste Hauschner. But when she gets in direct contact with Martin Buber, she is, being a successful, well-known writer herself, but at the same time a non-well-educated autodidact, shy as partly was Berta Pappenheim and shy as Etty Hillesum and many other women who get in direct contact with Buber. On a postcard she sends to Buber in January 1923, 1 year before her death, Hauschner wrote, and with this quote I will end, this is the postcard, "I'm now following the traces of mysticism that attaches itself to the third and fourth meals of the end of Sabbath. Can you perhaps tell me where I can find something about it? That is, if your time allows you at all to answer me a line." Thank you very much.